Welcome, Slayer the Alchemist, and welcome to a special episode with a very special guest. I'm pretty sure that most people out there know this guy, but just in case you don't, he's the OG of the hard rock and heavy metal YouTube channels. He's the guy that's inspired thousands of people to start their own YouTube channels, including myself. From the mighty Sea of Tranquility, we have Pete Pardo.
Going on, John? How's everybody doing?
Good, thanks,
Thanks
thanks,
for
thanks
that,
for
John. I
joining me.
appreciate it. I don't know if I'm actually that person, but if folks think
Sure
so,
you
hey,
are. I think you are. I can't tell you how many times I see a YouTube channel where they mentioned that, they watched you and it inspired them to start their own channel, just like me. I mean, that would inspired me. I
I
thought,
mean,
hey,
it's flattering to be an inspiration. I mean, it's like if I've done anything over the last 10 years of doing this and going back to the webzine, it's over 20 years. If people have liked what I've done and they have wanted to do something similar, because I mean, what's more fun than talking about music you love? There's really nothing more
exactly.
fun than that. So, yeah, if I've inspired people to kind of get off their ass and actually try and do this, that's cool. It's like, hey, we're all in the end, we're all music geeks and music nerds, and we love what we love, and we love talking about it, and that's the important thing, and showing a passion for the music. So that's cool.
Absolutely. And people ask me all the time, they're like, hey, you and Pete got to do something together. And so this is great. But Pete has actually been on the channel before, very early on in
It's
my
been a
channel.
while, I know. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it
been
was
a
it
while.
was like right when I first started my channel, I had Pete on and he sort of gave his backstory. It was really fascinating talking about the origins of Sea of Tranquility, the website, it was a print magazine at one point too, wasn't it?
Yep,
Right. So all the
absolutely.
way back to the print magazine, to the website, to the evolution to your YouTube channel. And we also did a video on Rush's 2112. So I'll leave those both linked down in the description down below. People can check those out. I was just on Pete's channel recently. Last week, we did a ranking of the band Warlord, and that was a ton of fun. Thank you so much for having me on. And we talked. I'm going to be popping in every now and then. Pete's invited me to Sea of Tranquility, where we're going to be doing some rankings of some more obscure 80s metal bands. So that's going to be a ton of fun because everybody knows who watches my channel. I love that kind of stuff. I think we have Omen slated
Yeah, Omen is probably gonna be the next one, which is really cool.
yeah,
It's
it's
a
cool.
band, I was into at the time, and I still have some of their stuff. And John and I were kind of surprised when we were looking at the discography that they've actually been somewhat active in recent years. We're like, oh, okay, that'll be new albums to the both of us, right? Other than the original, like
Yeah,
kind of 4 or 5 that everybody talks about. So that'll
yeah.
be fun.
Yeah, that's going to be cool. So keep your eyes out on the Sea of Tranquility channel. All right, so for today, if anybody, you people out there, I know you're all out there, y'all watch the Sea of Tranquility. You've probably seen Pete every now and then do these shorts where he busts out his guitar and starts ripping out some tasty licks. So Pete's a guitar player and I'm a bass player. And it occurred to me, this might be fun to do a video where we pick our three favorite guitar and bass duos. So these are guitar and bass players that maybe there's some chemistry between them. Maybe there's a little synergy. Maybe when you think of one, you think of the other. So we thought that this would be fun. So we're going to do this today. So Pete, why don't you start us off? And before you give us your first pick, tell us kind of what do you look for in a good guitar and bass team?
Yeah, there's lots of things, right, John? I mean, first of all, I always like when there's longevity there. Like, we've seen, and there are some spectacular guitar and bass teams where they only work together for a brief time, and it's just mind-blowing stuff. And then when it doesn't happen anymore, you miss it, right? And then there are the other teams that they have a long history. They've written together. They've played countless tours together over the years. And like you said, when you think of one, you think of the other. Maybe the lineup around them changes, that the drummers change, the singers change, but those two guys on guitar and bass are always there together. Sometimes they trade off during songs and live, and it's just like you get to see one blaze, you see the other blaze, they kind of follow each other. Other times you have the bass player who's constantly playing behind the riff, and it helps make the music all that much heavier and more kind of impactful. So there's like a lot of things that I look at, but most importantly, there's a chemistry there that sometimes you can't quite pinpoint it, but you know it's there. And that is something that we don't often look, because a lot of times when we think of musicians, we think of what the guitar player is doing, what that crazy drummer is doing, right? What the singer's up there doing. And a lot of times the bass player kind of gets forgotten in this whole equation. So when you have, and I think all of my three picks the bass player is pretty prominent. Everybody knows who the bass player is, and oftentimes gets as much credit and as much acclaim as their guitar playing partner, I think. So I think that to me was kind of a no-brainer. And I have, to me, there are two of my picks, two of my teams are fairly low-hanging fruit for me. And then the third one, which I'll probably talk about first, was one that I had to think about for a while, and I wanted to come up with one that maybe most folks wouldn't normally think of, but then once I talk about them, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, that one makes perfect sense."
Awesome. All right, so what do you got for your first pick?
All right, so my first pick. So this is a band that's going way back. They actually came to get this band came together in the wake of the breakup of the Vanilla Fudge. And so all of a sudden they brought together. So you got Carmine Appice and Tim Bogert, who are the bass and
Hmm.
drum portion of a team of this particular band. But very early on from their very first album, I'm talking about Cactus, we've got a guy named Jim McCarty, of course, coming in from the Detroit Wheels. And he joins up with those two cats. And all of a sudden, you've got this great, heavy, melodic bass player, Tim Bogert, who kind of forms this great team with Jim McCarty, a guy who, as we've seen on albums like, this and this, and Restrictions as well, one way or another, Restrictions. And all of a sudden now you kind of almost forget that the original kind of team was Carmine and Tim. And now all of a sudden you've got Tim and Jim, Carmine, Jim and Tim. It sounds like a cartoon or something like that. And the way that Tim plays a lot of lead bass on these songs, and again, Cactus pretty much just a real raucous, raw blues rock band. That's basically what they are. A lot of people call them the American answer to Led Zeppelin. I never saw the Led Zeppelin comparisons at all in the music of Cactus, other than they're American and they're heavy and they play bluesy rock, whatever. But to me, they don't sound anything like them. But McCarty's guitar work, again, he's coming from a blues background, but very metallic, lots of slashing chords and just absolutely face melting, ripping leads. And he used a lot of gain on his guitar. And then this just kind of boosted Tim's bass playing, I think, even
Yeah.
more because when you listen to like Vanilla Fudge, if you go back to listen to the band that was before this, very much saturated with Mark Stein's organ,
Yeah.
that more of an organ band with, the bass, you could hear the bass there, but not really a prominent instrument. However, in Cactus, you've got the thunderous drums of Carmine Appice, and then up front, you've got Tim Bogert and Jim McCarty, kind of almost like fighting for who's going to be the one we're going to hear the most in the mix. But
Yeah.
it works out so well. And where you really can tell the synergy between these two guys, if you listen to some of their, like, there's so much live material out there, but like I've got these couple of live albums here. And in live, it's amazing. And they're both trading off solos. Kind of goes back to, I think, a duo you're going to talk about in
Hmm.
just a few minutes, where you have these two amazing soloists who kind of play off each other. But yet, because of the presence of McCarty here, Bogert all of a sudden said, I'm going to become you have guitar heroes. Well, I'm going to be a bass hero in this band as well.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be a soloist too. And he and I are going to do some amazing things together. And it's like, that's why I think, the albums themselves are great. But if you listen to the old Cactus live recordings from this time period, and we're looking at, I mean, these two only played together for a couple of years. I mean, I think Restrictions was what, 72, 71. So literally in 1970, 71 and into 72, that was it. And then uh, McCarty left and you had another guitar player come in and it wasn't quite the same after that. And then the band broke up. But then you had, everybody went off and did other things. But yeah, I think again, this is not my other two. There's lots of longevity, like I talked about. So this is an example of a bass player and a guitar player who only worked together for a really short time, but did some really spectacular things. And I think that them working together helped both of them raise their game in a really, really big way. And that's why I think when I listen to those, and I like the more recent Cactus stuff a lot, but it's these three albums where they did some magic together in that really short span of time. And I think
Mm.
you've got a couple coming up too where there was magic happening, but not for a long period of time. So this is gonna fall in line with a couple of yours where you have just a couple of albums and a couple short years where this duo did some amazing, amazing things. And I think perhaps influenced a lot of other bands to come afterwards, including maybe some of the ones that I'm going to talk about next. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, that's a great pick. I love Tim Bogart's bass playing, and especially on those Cactus records. It's loud, it's distorted, it's
Yeah.
really very much an influence on somebody who's going to be on my list a little bit later on. Uh, and you're right, in Vanilla Fudge, you could hear his bass, but there's a lot going on in Vanilla Fudge between the keyboards and all the vocals and everything.
Yeah.
Whereas this is like just a stripped down three-piece. Everybody's going for it. Sometimes when you have a situation where there's one or two busy players, regardless of the instrument on, there's somebody who kind of holds it down, that stays kind of simple to hold. But this is not really the case here. Everybody is just going all out. It sounds
Yeah.
like it was recorded live in the studio. I mean, off the top of my head, can't even remember if there's any like guitar overdubs. It just sounds like it's live in the studio. Everybody cranked their amps up and they just, went for it in like a sort of a classic
I mean,
70s.
I just take the song, the title track to one way or another, right? So, Jim comes in with this, it's absolutely crushing, face melting riff. And then right behind him comes Tim, and it's just like, it's this wall of sound. And you're absolutely right. There's no overdubs going on here. These just guys ready to just lay
Yeah.
it down. And then you got Carmine behind who's just thundering away,
Yeah.
Rusty Day's vocals. I mean, this band was like a go for the throat band. And like I said, if you're new to Cactus, folks, these three studio albums are really good, but they're great actually. But go and listen to some of the live records because that's where and Tim is just so loud in the mix. And this, I think, at this point in time, like this concept of bass player as a soloist,
Yeah.
kind of new. There's another band that came before them that I think that really started to happen. But, we would see that a lot going forward. But at the time, not really done all that much. Usually you had your piano or organ player and your guitar player, certainly. But here, you basically got three guys who are all soloists, all kind of jockeying
Yeah.
for position because you can't not
Yeah.
include Carmine here because Carmine does some
Yeah.
amazing stuff on these albums. But yeah, very, very different from Tim's work in Vanilla Fudge, which he was more of like kind of like a I don't want to say a role player because Tim Bogart can never be a role player, but when you got that organ from Mark Stein
Yeah.
and
That
even
much stuff going on.
Martell's guitar was pretty prominent. Kind of hard for him to find his voice in all of that kind of
Yeah.
craziness. Here, you got the three musicians here all trying to make it happen together, and I think it worked really, really well. I think that was what was so um, engaging about Cactus when they first burst on the scene because it really, for like a US band, pretty different. There were a lot of British bands that were doing this kind of like bluesy hard rock thing, but that wasn't really big here in the States. But I think
Yeah.
Cactus were one of the first bands who really kind of took what the Brits were doing and said, okay, we're going to do that here. So it worked out well.
Yeah. Yeah, great pick. All right. So for me, you've alluded to this group here, and yeah, they are sort of the ones that sort of set the stage for Cactus and other bands to follow like this, and that's Cream, Jack
Yeah.
Bruce, and Eric Clapton. A lot of people say they're the first super group. Eric's coming out of the Yardbirds and everything. He already has a reputation. Uh, they're maybe one of the first super like everybody in the band is a great player. Jack Bruce, an amazing bass player and vocalist. Eric Clapton, great guitar player. He also sings. Ginger Baker is an amazing John Bonham like drummer, very heavy, drummer. And Jack and Eric, especially now, like you mentioned, they only have a couple albums, but you really got to listen to Cream in a live setting. Not that the studio stuff isn't good, but it's really in the live setting where they shine because they really stretch out and they'll take a song that's a 5-minute song on the record turns into a whole side of an album. And when Eric is soloing, Jack is just underneath him playing like crazy. He's got the kind of see it here. He played an SG type bass. He
Yeah.
had a really farty, distorted sound that really made him stand out in the mix. And when you hear Eric start soloing and Jack is underneath him, almost like pushing him, there's like sort of this battle. It's sort of a little bit like you described with Cactus, where it's kind of like all three of those guys are like they're all battling
Yeah,
for
yeah.
space. Where with Cream, it's the same thing, like Jack and Eric. Eric soloing and Jack Bruce is just underneath him, like playing these lines and propelling it forward and sort of pushing Eric to go even further and farther. And at that time, nobody was, I mean, the British blues thing was happening, like Eric with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers and stuff like that. But nobody was playing as loud as this. Nobody was playing as taking these blues licks and putting them through really loud Marshalls and playing them, this heavy Hendrix, isn't even around at this point. Hendrix right around the corner. He would be influenced by the Cream, as a lot of people say. So yeah, he's the first guy that, I want to say, man, is he like the first lead bass player, one of these guys? And I got to think about when Entwistle, I mean, the Who wasn't even quite around at this point, right? I mean, the Who was like
They
60,
were, yeah, the
67.
Who were, but they, Entwistle, what, I mean, he threw the bass solo in My Generation, right?
Yeah,
Which was unheard of to have a bass solo in a song. But I think like the Who, from an improvisational standpoint, I don't think we're doing anything
no,
quite like what Cream were doing. Cream basically were the leaders in that thing, and that's why I said earlier, I don't think you get Cactus as Cactus
yeah,
without Cream. And I mean, I don't remember whether it was Bruce or Clapton who said early on, "We're just a blues band who loves jazz improvisational,
yeah,
stuff," and that's essentially what they are, especially live, because the albums are kind of artsy, right, in a weird way.
yeah,
And then you listen to the live record, you're like, "Wow, that's quite different." It gets heavier, and it's just all this
yeah,
jamming and everything, and
yeah,
yeah, and you have to. I think especially back then, I think ego plays a big part in a lot of things. I mean, we know from history that all three guys in Cream had really massive egos. And you could almost sense when you're listening to the live records that they're all trying to like one up each other.
yeah,
They're just soloing left and right. And, and I love when like, and this is always really interesting about Cream, like when Clapton is taking a long solo, listen to what Bruce is doing.
yeah,
He's not just sitting there, sitting back on the
no,
beat. He's doing all this really intricate stuff, and I'm like, uh, it's just amazing. And it's almost like you can't listen to any live Cream stuff. You don't want to just hear Clapton going off, right? Because your other ears got to be keeping track of what Bruce is doing. And then
yeah,
Baker is a whole other story. I
yeah,
mean, that's really it's the Cactus formula once again, because again, you got these three amazing soloists working together, and everybody's trying to one up each other. But yeah, Cream. I mean, that's where all of this conversation today started for me is with
yeah,
this whole
yeah,
idea of this bass player and the guitar player doing amazing things together, even if like they hated their guts, which I know history shows they really didn't get along all that well. None of these three, but I think that both Bruce and Clapton pushed each other to levels that they never gone to before. We really heard what Clapton could do on that first Blues Breakers album, but Bruce at the time was sort of like an unknown quantity. He played with Graham Bond organization, but I think that he became a household name in Cream. But man, that's two absolutely amazing players that I think for the first time we got that kind of lead soloist from a bass player and a guitar player in the same band together, really kind of pushing themselves and the music. And that's the blueprint for everything we're talking about today.
yeah. I don't think you don't have Led Zeppelin, you don't have Black Sabbath. Geezer Butler is always cited. Jack Bruce is his biggest influence. You don't have Cactus. You don't have, basically, they're the first sort of guys to really take that step out of the 60s, setting up Hendrix, setting up Sabbath, setting up Zeppelin and all that stuff. And yeah, this sort of the way Jack and Eric and I don't think they ever really found that chemistry again. As much as I love some of Jack Bruce's solo records, is I'm not as
Very
much of
different.
a fan of Eric's solo stuff, but the stuff that he Derek and the Dominoes and stuff like that. Blind Faith, that stuff is cool. But he never really, neither one of them, all three of them, never really had, that thing. And again, and maybe part of it is just when you get giants, like it's like a basketball team with like three, Michael Jordan and LeBron James. If all these guys were on the same team together, it's almost like it can't work because they're all so good. It does work, but it can only work for a short period of time because these
Yeah,
guys are
before it
just so
explodes.
good. They're so powerful. Their personalities, their egos, their talent, and everything like that. It's just like, it's just not meant to last. It's something you can only put it together for a little while, and it's a really, all of a sudden it explodes after a short time. But they're the band that really launched so many other bands after
Yeah,
this.
it's interesting when you really stop to think about the aftermath of Cream, right? So we know history shows, and he's said it many times, that like Cream, that whole situation, I think, scared the crap out of Clapton. He experienced things in that band that I think he wasn't really ready for, and he did not want to be that, kind of guitar god type of thing. So, like, if you listen to like, I love the Blind Faith album. I think that's great, and I agree with you. Kind of like after Blind Faith and Derek and the Dominoes, I like some of his solo stuff. A lot of it I don't like at all. And I think he wanted to kind of take a step back from that spotlight, being that guitar player in the front of the stage that everybody's watching, that everybody emulates and idolizes and does all this. That's not Clapton. And I think that the other two guys, because if you listen to a lot of Jack Bruce's solo stuff, especially in the aftermath of Cream, those are like jazz rock records, and they're
Yeah,
actually really, really good. But it's night and day from what Cream were doing.
yeah,
And and then of course he hooked up with Leslie West and Corky Lang and West
yeah,
Bruce and Lang, and that basically was Cream all over again.
yeah.
But a few years later and a lot more drugs later, right? I mean that became like, I mean, it is great. I love that band, but they were like that. You talk about egos and self-destruction. I mean, that took Cream to the next level.
Yeah.
And Ginger Baker, which maybe a lot of people watching have never listened to this stuff. Ginger Baker, a few years later, formed a band with the Gervitz brothers from the band Gun, the
Hmm.
Baker Gervitz Army, and that is basically again an extension of what Cream were doing, but with like some prog and a little more artsy stuff thrown in. Those albums are really, really good, and I would urge anybody to check those out. And Ginger, again, the Gervitz brothers, one on guitar, one on bass, kind of formed this kind of power trio nucleus, and they brought in a singer as well. But Ginger's doing some incredible drum work on those albums, and there's just some great Guitar Hero type stuff from Adrian Gervitz. So that is well worth checking out. And again, that's another perfect example of a guitar and bass duo in that band, and they happen to be brothers. They work so well together. But we're getting off track here, talking about all these side bands, because a lot of these bands you could talk about
Yeah,
this whole kind of rock and roll family tree, right, of all the different bands that these guys kind of went through after the bands we're talking about,
yeah.
especially these first couple. So yeah, great pick with Cream. Totally.
Awesome. All right, what do you got for your second pick?
All right, so you kind of mentioned them before, and I think this is like low-hanging fruit, but it's a no-brainer because again, this goes to that whole longevity thing of two guys that were there together from the beginning, and up until fairly recently were there together. They had some time in between where they weren't working together, but they always seem to get back together, and that's Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler from Black Sabbath. No-brainer here, and this is a perfect example of where you don't have the two guys that are these uh, big personalities, soloists doing all this crazy stuff. You basically have this kind of humble, laid back bass player who early on wrote all the lyrics, who basically is always following the riff in most of these classic Sabbath records. Again, like back from the debut, as from the home, again, early on, a heavy blues rock band, but just like a lot of these bands started with, but all of a sudden morphed into this thing we now call doom and everything like that. And on all these classic records, you got those big bulbous bass tones from Geezer, and he's basically following Tony around all the time in the arrangements. But man, it just makes the impact of these songs so much greater, so much bigger and beefier. And you can go through any number of these records, right? They're all, and even up until I would argue the early '80s, when obviously Geezer no longer has to write anymore, and he's just kind of helping with the arrangements. Ronnie James Dio takes over on the vocals, and and this as well. But everywhere you go, Geezer's bass very up front in the mix. Like, has anybody ever said, John, on especially all these classic Sabbath records, I can never hear the bass? How many bands you look at and you talk about? It's like I can never
Yeah,
hear the bass player. You never say that about Geezer. He's always there, and maybe he's not always doing this real busy stuff. He does in a lot of
yeah,
spots, but it's just as impactful as Tony's riffs. And if you take Geezer out of the equation, are a lot of these songs quite as
right.
oomph without him? I don't think they are. As much as Tony is, and he's my favorite guitar player of all time, and the greatest riff master we've ever known in heavy music or music in general. You got to have Geezer there with him, like every step of
Yeah,
the way. And as someone who's seen Sabbath a lot over the years and watched a ton of footage, it's like those two guys have to be up there together. They just have to be. It's like, you look stage left and stage right, there they are. There you can always see them kind of looking at each other and following each other, even though they're doing their own separate thing. But the kind of for the greater good of that wall of sound that is Black Sabbath, you have to have both of them there, I think. And I remember like a couple of tours where I saw Sabbath where Geezer wasn't in the band, and of course the albums where Geezer doesn't play on those kind of some of those Tony Martin albums and whatnot and Seven Star. What's missing on them?
yeah.
Ace. It's glaring when he's not there. And when he's back, when he comes back to the band, you're like, there it is again. Everything is right again with Sabbath because Geezer is there. Tony's always going to be there,
Yeah.
but Geezer's got to be in the equation as well. And I don't think that Sabbath were ever quite as successful when those two guys weren't together. And when they are together, whoever the singer might be, it's Black Sabbath because Tony and Geezer are there.
Yeah, that's a great pick, and it's a great pick because it's like you mentioned that Geezer a lot of times follows Iommi on the riff, although there are times where he sort of stretches out. Like when Iommi's soloing, for instance, under
Yeah,
War Pigs, that's very Cream-like. When
yeah.
Iommi's soloing and Geezer's like going crazy underneath, that's a total Cream influence there. But when the two of them are like locked in playing a riff together, it's like they sort of melt together and it becomes
Becomes one
one,
person, right?
yeah, it
It's just like,
becomes
yeah.
one big sound. And I encourage people out there. I don't know if you've watched the channel Rick Beato. I don't know if you know who Rick Beato is. He did a video once where he was trying to get the sound, the guitar sound on Into the Void from Master of Reality, and he had the amp. He had, I mean, he's a guy that he knows how to do these things. He's got
Oh
a
yeah.
studio, right? So he really, really got the sound really, really close. And at one point he stops and he says, "But what really makes the sound is Geezer Butler's bass, and he throws the bass, a Geezer like bass sound underneath this guitar sound, and it's like there it is. Like when you just hear Iommi sound on its own, it's kind of like, ooh, gee, that's not as like bassy and heavy as I would think it would
You
be.
say what's missing, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. What's missing? It sounds like there's something missing here, but as soon as you add the bass in, it's like it just slots right in, and there's just oh, okay, there's that massive, bottom underneath it. So yeah, they're a perfect. That's a good example of like the two coming together for the greater good of the whole thing. And you're right, when Geezer is not there, even when Geezer is like Geezer was on Osmosis, Ozzy's solo album Osmosis, and you can hear him. He stands out. He's one of those bass players that sonically and with the notes that he plays and everything, he just stands out and he just makes the situation better and more Sabbath like. Geezer was out for a few years. He wasn't on Seven Star, he wasn't on Eternal Idol, he wasn't on Headless Cross, he wasn't on Tear, but then he was on Cross Purposes,
Yeah.
and it just automatically makes the record darker sounding. And so yeah,
And there's no disrespect to Neil Murray, right? Who I think is a great bass player. He's not, it's his sound and his style, while fine for Sabbath, it's not quite the same. It's not
yeah,
quite the same.
yeah. And those guys always talk about, especially Bill, well, I should say Bill Ward talks about this because the other guys are all pretty, quiet. They don't usually go into anything, but Bill likes to get spiritual and he'll talk about the band, and he always sort of talks about how there's this fifth member, as he calls it, or there's just this secret, like there's just a connection. And maybe it's because they all grew up in the same neighborhood, they all came up together like that. And that's just something that you can't replicate any other way. It has to be the four of them in a room together to create that magic, that they just lock in with each other on a wavelength or something. And I definitely hear that between Tony and Geezer. It's almost like because they came up together, they shaped their sound together, they shaped their style together, they learned how to play together, they learned how to, and so it's like they've just become like one sound, if you will. So yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great pick.
And you mentioned like War Pigs is like I think the greatest example of how well that worked early on. Even the beginning, Tony comes in with that opening riff, and then there's
Oh yeah.
Geezer doom doom doom, and he's just kind of
Yeah,
walking around the riff and everything like that. And then during the solo, he's doing all this really furious stuff, and that's how it works. And then like during the main parts of the song, he's kind of following the riff with Tony, but like all throughout other parts of the song, he's kind of doing all this other stuff that I think kind of it just like envelops everything else like that the riffing is going on and there's Geezer he's kind of going around in circles and kind of pulling everything in and it's just that it just works so well with this band when those two
absolutely.
guys are
Yeah,
together.
great pick. Okay, my second pick. This is, I think, because these two, when you think of the one, you sort of think of the other, and this is a longevity thing. He's been in the band a really long time. He's not in the band at the moment, but Dave Mustaine and Dave Elfson. Uh, Dave and Dave Jr., right? You sort
Yeah.
of picture these two when you think of one, you think of the other. Even when Dave Jr., when Jr. wasn't in the band anymore, it was always one of those things like you kind of felt like he was going to eventually come
Oh,
back into the band. And there's in this case, there's no like Jack Bruce and Eric Clapton type interplay, being that Megadeth is a thrash band and it's more, the riffs are there and everything. But he is another guy whose bass sound is very slots in really nicely into the Megadeth sound. He's a pick player, so he has kind of a brighter, as opposed to like let's say Cliff Burton, who had kind of more of a finger. He was a finger style player with a little bit of a darker sound. Dave Jr. has a real sort of bright pick sound, and he's kind of right there, and he has all these interesting little lines. They're subtle, but they kind of add to the song. And this was the case. I did this pick because it's kind of almost personalities too. These are almost like two personalities that when you think of one, you think of the other. And a lot of times in thrash metal, the bass is really lost in the mix, and it's just
yeah,
kind of
for sure.
not there. But with Megadeth, Junior's bass is always nice, sits nicely within the mix, and I always thought he complemented the band really well. So when I wanted to get somebody too from like the thrash, maybe the mid '80s. So this was just the first thing that comes to mind. And again, a lot of it is because they're almost like brothers in a lot of way. They fight and everything, but they sort of have this connection with each other that just
And it
to just
really started
sort of,
on the Peace Cells album. I mean, you can hear him quite a bit on that record.
yeah.
And and the one interesting thing about Dave Jr., I guess, he's had this opportunity to play with in so many different lineups, Megadeth, where you had these two amazing guitar
Hmm.
players because Dave is great, and whether it's Chris Poland or Jeff Young or Marty Friedman or whoever, right? I mean, just think about the ability to work alongside two guys who are just
Yeah.
churning out all these amazing, intricate riffs and blazing solos. And there you are trying to keep all this kind of cacophony
Yeah.
reeled in a little bit. And he always has done a spectacular job of that. Always.
Yeah. Yeah. He's been sort of the glue through all those different guitar players and everything. So for
But
sure.
yeah, you're right. In thrash, the bass player oftentimes gets kind of buried in the mix or just kind of forgotten because with thrash, it's all about the guitars and the drums, right? For the most
Yeah.
part. In a Megadeth, that's what people are looking for. Same thing. Testament's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
But Testament also has some really good bass players over the years. But you're tuning in to hear those riffs and to hear those blazing solos. That's just and the crazy drum, and that's just what it is. But when you can stand out amidst all of that, you got Dee Dee Verney and Overkill's another guy who does it really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. He's
Um,
right.
yeah, but that's not the norm. And I'd argue that, you mentioned Cliff Burton before. Cliff Burton also is a guy who worked really well with his guitar players in Metallica. And I'd argue that since Cliff passed away, I don't know if any of the Jason Newsted or drawing a
Robert
blank on
Trujillo.
Trujillo. I don't know that either of them have really stood out much in the music of Metallica. It's almost like Cliff kind of set the path, and then everybody who came in his wake in that band just has kind of done their thing. And because Cliff was also a really good soloist. And I
Yeah,
think that and that's kind of different for thrash because you don't see that too
yeah,
often. You got guys like Steve DiGiorgio, who obviously they're very, very capable to be that kind of lead bass player in a thrash or even a death metal band, but not a lot of them do that. So
yeah. And I think Cliff was maybe because of his age, he was a little older than the other guys, and he wrote songs too, was involved in the songwriting part of it. I think he had this respect of James and Lars, where Cliff was the cool guy that was probably able to get between the two of them and just sort of fit nicely between the two of them sonically and also musically and personality wise and everything. And I think when Cliff wasn't there anymore, then it just became Lars and James. And
yeah.
you could argue, whatever side you want to take on that, but there was definitely missing that there was that, they never had that strong musical personality again,
Because
unfortunately,
Kirk's not
unfortunately.
that guy.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, I always get the impression he just kind of follows along what everybody else wants to
Cool.
do, and he's not. And he will deflect to them to do whatever, and
Yeah.
he's okay. That's cool, But whereas Cliff,
Yeah,
I don't think was that. Cliff was a very headstrong person, I think, and a great music visionary. And they lost something when he passed away, for sure.
for sure. All right, what do you got for your third and last pick?
All right, so my third and last pick, and I kind of went in order of when these band, Sabbath and Cactus kind of came out around the same time, but this band followed in the wake of both of those bands. And the band is Rush, and of course it's Alex Lifeson and Geddy Lee, who, again, this is a longevity thing, right? This is a tale of two guys who have been playing together for a long, 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 long time, and we've had the luxury of seeing their relationship together over the years. And to me,
Mm.
they're as great as watching them play together or listening to the albums and hearing, that amazing bass playing and those all those guitar textures kind of weaving around each other. I think of the Rush documentary.
Oh yeah.
At the end of the documentary, where these two guys are sitting down in a restaurant,
Yep.
having dinner and drinking glass after glass of
Yeah.
wine together, and it's just like, look at this relationship, right? It's just like heartwarming. Like
Yeah, it is. It's
these
charming
guys,
almost. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, they've had their ups and downs. I read Getty. I don't know if you read Getty's book, which I
Yeah.
thought was extraordinary. And you read about they've gone through their difficult times together. More so, I think, from a music standpoint than from a creativity standpoint than from a personal standpoint. I think as human beings, they've always been brothers. But they've gone through their things together where, Alex struggled with Getty's kind of dominance in songwriting and putting arrangements together and the direction of the band and utilizing technology. But I think if you go through, like, and it starts right here, again, musically, this is very different than everything that came back. But here you've got this very dominant guitar player and guitar tone with an equally uh, dominant bass player, right? And,
Yeah.
John Rutsey on drums, whatever. And then, you bring in Neil, and now you've got these three absolute virtuosos who are uh, coming from similar backgrounds in the music that they like. Again, the guys in Rush, especially Geddy and Alex, who were massive fans of Cream and
Yeah.
Zeppelin and Sabbath, right? And Yes, and all these prog rock bands, and now trying to create this new sound. But what I love about Rush is that Geddy, again, kind of like from the, I guess he takes it from his Jack Bruce influence, an amazing soloist. And
Hmm.
it's a perfect example of how a bass player can not only anchor the sound, but can be a lead player within a band with an equally amazing player on the guitar side who is also good at creating riffs and doing lots of textures to allow the bass player to shine.
Yeah.
And that's what I've always loved about the music of Rush is that they both shine, but in different ways, and they never seem to step on each other's toes. I mean, how many cool arrangements where you have Alex doing this cool riffing and these textures and soloing, and then he drops back, and then Getty comes out.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
thinking
yeah.
like Free Will comes to mind, right?
Right, right.
And then that letting Getty come in and just blow your mind for a couple of bars, and then Alex coming back in, and it's just like it's almost like the synergy between them is amazing. And then you throw Neil in, right? And YYZ or YYZ, depending on where you
Yeah.
live, how you say it. The stuff that they're doing, weaving around each other like
Oh
it's
yeah.
effortless, is just amazing. And even if as you get on in their catalog, maybe like starting with Signals, right? Where all of a sudden you're starting to see more keyboards and synthesizers and different types of textures from Alex, and maybe not as much big riffs or
Yeah.
lengthy solos. They work so well together. But you still have not Neil, Getty as that kind of lead bass player.
Hmm.
And I think that he never really lost that. Maybe in the later albums, the sound gets a little bit more dense. The productions are a little bit different, and you don't hear as much of that lead bass from Getty. It's kind of a similar thing with Iron Maiden. Like, you remember those early
Yeah.
Maiden albums?
Yeah.
You hear all this great lead bass work from
Yeah.
Steve Harrison. You don't really get a lot of that anymore within the confines of the song. Sure, at the beginning you get these big long bass
Yeah.
intros. Yeah, we get it. But I'm thinking like Innocent Exile and
Right.
Killers and things like that, where all you get this amazing bass work from Steve, and you don't hear that much of that anymore. But I think throughout the career of Rush, you always had these two guys who never really liked to step on each other's toes, but they always allowed each other room to breathe. But it always sounded so perfect together. Their playing always really meshed so well together, but it was always very distinct from each other. Like this was
Yeah.
never like we talked about how um Geezer in a lot of instances would follow the riffs of Tony. That's was never really the case with Rush. Like, Getty was always allowed to be very busy underneath everything, and yet it worked so well, and it never sounded like he was trying to overtake what Alex was doing and vice versa. But they always just gave each other the same amount of space, and it's just so unique. That's why I think the music of Rush works so well, because of these two guys being able to give each other that room within the arrangements.
Yeah, awesome pick. And you had to have that pick on this list. And I especially loved it from like when you hear them in this, like on this live album
Yeah,
where they're Alex is riffing along, and then when he goes into a lead and the bass is just going underneath them, I love that. And you mentioned Iron Maiden, like early Iron Maiden too, when the two guitars would start playing harmony lines at the top, and the bass is just underneath it. I mean, that goes back to that Cream thing where you're together, all of a sudden the solo comes and it's just like guitar on top and the bass is going at the bottom. Yeah, so I always love that. And as much as the keyboard side of Rush has grown on me over the years, I still just love that early three-piece. The guitar starts soloing and the bass is just because there's just so much space in the sound. And when you have a three-piece, when I mean three-piece, when it's just instruments three-piece, you can have a lead vocalist mixed in there. But when you have a three-piece with the instruments, it just gives you all this space to let the guitar, the bass, and the drummer just go and do their thing. And this is a great example of a band who each guy kind of has their own personality. You put it all together and it fits together. And Alex is a guy that sort of gets overshadowed a little bit. Geddy's the singer, he's the bass player, he's playing keys, he's up front. Neil Peart is, you could say the greatest drummer of all time. He's a very, really stands out. He writes the lyrics and everything. And then it's kind of like Alex Lifeson, and you hear a lot of bass players influenced by Geddy Lee. Tons and tons. Every drummer is influenced by Neil Peart. Alex doesn't get the same amount of love. And there's people
no,
out there though that know him. And if when you listen to him and you really dig into what Alex is doing, even during the keyboard era stuff, this is what I love about Alex. He was able to adapt to how the band changed, and he became a little bit more textural with the chords and the sounds and the way he blended him. He adapted to where Rush went. And I think he reminds me a little bit of like John Paul Jones. He's this guy that is overshadowed by everybody else, but he fits in really nicely into the sound of the band. And you couldn't have anybody else in Rush but Alex. And I think maybe him being humble enough. A lot of times the lead guitar player feels like, oh, it's I'm the lead guitar player here. It's usually it's a battle between the lead guitar player and the front man, right? Because they both feel like they should be the center of attention. But Alex has never had a problem, I think, being able to step back and not being, the guy in the band. And like you said, that the way Getty and Alex, they have this history together, much like we talked about Black Sabbath, how these guys grew up with each other. Well, Getty and Alex grew up with each other too, and so there's just this bond between the two of them that, like you said, it's endearing, it's charming. I think it's that same video. They're driving around in a car, and they're, oh, that's where we went to school, and you remember that teacher? Ha ha ha! Just like you would with your buddies and everything. And it's really kind of cool that they have this, and you see that on stage too, that they're, whereas in Cream maybe they were all fighting for the spotlight. I never felt that in Rush. I felt like everybody
Not at all.
was really, I mean, even Getty, even though he's the front person, he never comes across as like, a front man in the sense of like, put the spotlight on me and, I'm gonna stay. He was never like that. It was all very much a unit, like they're one thing. So yeah, that's a great pick, and I'm glad you picked that one.
Yeah, I mean, I love the whole concept of Alex Lifeson almost, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? I think in the history of Rush, especially from us fans, we all love Alex, but I think he almost gets overlooked, or we take him for granted. I think that's what I was looking
Yeah,
to say.
yeah,
We like take him for granted because he's, early on, he was the big guitar hero in the band, this big ferocious tone, right? Great solos, lots of textures. I go back to like an album like Caress
yeah,
of Steel, which, is a lot of fans, one of their weaker albums from the 70s. But he just monstrous stuff he's doing on that record. And then in there you have on that album, you really have the two of them really starting to make an impact on the music that's going forward in the bass style and the guitar riffs and the textures and solos and things like that. But I think once like the 70s wore on and you had Alex doing less riffy stuff and more textures and these very meticulous solos, because I would argue, and I agree with you, early on, the more synth dominated Rush stuff from the 80s, like Grace Under Pressure through like Presto, I wasn't a huge fan of. I've grown to appreciate that stuff much more and more. But the reason why at the time, I kind of rejected that stuff is because it was so keyboard centric
mm-hmm.
and where's all the big riffs and
Yeah,
things
yeah.
from
Where's the
Alex, right?
guitar?
He's doing all
Yeah,
these kind of weird chord voicings and using lots of effects and
yeah,
different kind of guitars and clean tones and doing this kind of like Andy Summers thing. But yet
yeah,
if you go back now all these years later, I've grown a greater appreciation for those albums because I think texturally they're very, very cool. They're very different. But if you listen to his solos on a lot of those albums, they're really, really good.
yeah,
Like he really, I think he realized that, okay, well, I'm having less of an impact on these songs and these arrangements from a riff perspective, but I'm going to do whatever I can do to colorize them with some different chords and different sounds. But I'm really going to work hard on the solos and make them really count. And some of his best soloing is on those albums. But yeah, I always miss the big riffy things. And, yeah, you pulled out all the world to stage, right? I mean,
yeah.
that's like Guitar Hero stuff right there. That's I mean the tones on that
Yeah,
album and on all those records, 2112 and Hemispheres, All the World to Stage, and even Moving Pictures and Permanent Waves, right? Great guitar playing from Alex. And all of a sudden we had to get used to Rush without Alex, the guitar hero, for a
yeah,
number of years. And I know that bothered him a little bit, but rather than cause friction between him and Getty,
yeah,
he kind of went along with it, right? Even though I think Getty finally realized years later that it really did bother Alex more than he thought it did. But it never really it never really gave their relationship any sort of a negative aspect at all. It didn't really, there may have been some tension there from a creative standpoint, but on a personal level, it never really did anything, which is good because that sort of thing has broken up many other bands
yeah,
in history,
exactly.
So.
Yeah. Okay, for my third pick, this one I strictly went for the chops. These are just two guys with a massive amount of chops. I'm talking about Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan. David Lee Roth, yeah, he had the California Girls EP thing, but that really wasn't his first solo album. Everybody was kind of waiting for this. He leaves Van Halen Everybody's wondering what he's going to do. You can't come out of a band like Van Halen and not have a real serious guitar player in your band. So, man, I'm no one fills Eddie's shoes, but who can come in and at least be in the same, universe as Eddie? Steve Vai. Uh, Steve Vai is an amazing sort of technical player. So who else are you going to put in the band up against Steve Vai? Billy Sheehan. Billy Sheehan at this point had played with his band Talus. Talus had played with Van Halen a few times. There's even stories about Billy being approached to join Van Halen. Billy also has these high vocal harmony things that he does. So he sort of fills that slots in there too for where Michael Anthony has. And Michael Anthony, another guy who he's almost like the Alex Lifeson of Van Halen. He contributes a lot to the band, probably more than people realize. But here, it's all about the showmanship. It's when I think of Dave in this era, it's a show. Dave is a show and is in himself like a Las Vegas show. He's big, he's jumping, the kicks, the outfits and everything, and he wanted the same thing from the musicians behind him. Greg Bizinet on drums, he's an amazing drummer. But Steve and Billy there, man, just the two of them.
Because those two guys are the tightrope guys, right? So it's
Exactly.
right. So
Yeah.
Dave is like the circus barker down below, and these two guys are jumping off the tightrope and doing all this crazy shit up on top, and
Yeah.
that's what they do. That's what they're there for.
Yeah, and it's nuts. And you just listen to there's a song on the album, Shy Boy, which was actually a song from Billy's
Yeah,
band Talus.
Alice.
And it just has this just mind-blowing like guitar and bass, playing these tapping licks together and everything. It's just completely over the top, and it's completely Dave's personality now, and even maybe even more so back then. Dave was this completely over the top personality. And in order for this to work, he had to have guys that had big, huge personalities that were really going to jump out of the record and on stage. Billy and Steve on stage are running around back and forth doing all kinds of, one guy's playing, the other guy's get, they're just totally insane. And that's a relationship that the two of them would, after this, they would play on and off with each other. These G3 tours and things like that. Steve and Billy would always have this, it was also both their first really, really big band that really brought both of them to the public eye. Steve had played with Frank Zappa and Alcatraz, but this was the first, like, really putting both these guys in the spotlight, and it really launched their careers for them. Billy would go on to form Mr. Big later on, but it was here, and there's no denying that you know the chemistry because of the levels of the chops here. There's very few people that could chops wise hang with Steve Vai, and the same thing with Billy Sheehan, the way he plays bass. If you listen to Talus, if you've ever heard Talus, the guitar is just very, especially the first version of Talus, the guitar is very just straightforward, kind of Pete Townsend like, and Billy's over the top,
Doing all
like
this
just
wild
going
stuff.
total lead bass over the top. But here it was like, total gunslingers. These guys are just like, they're just it's on 10 all the time. The chops are just flying left and right, but they're right there with each other. So when I thought of this, I thought, okay, I gotta have Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan for the insane level of musicianship and
Yeah, it's a
chops.
great pick, and that this is like the kind of the wow factor, right? When you get
Right.
a guitar player and a bass player that work together that are both like absolutely crazy instrumentalists and like shred lords, right? And I think what's really interesting about this lineup and these two guys together is, you look at both of their careers kind of after that. And while you mentioned that they played with each other on and off over the years, they never really formed another band together,
Hmm.
which I always thought was kind of like a shame that they didn't do so. But you had like Billy specifically, obviously formed Mr. Big, working with a guy like Paul Gilbert. A lot of
Hmm.
similar qualities
Yeah.
between Vine and Gilbert, right? So he kind of had that relationship. And then you think of Winery Dogs, there you got Billy and Richie Kotzen,
Yep.
again, kind of cut from the same cloth, maybe a little bit more soulful player than a guy like Vi. And Steve worked with Stu Ham for many years and
Hmm.
lots of other great bass players. So I think that something clicked in both of them working in Roth's band that they both were like, well, going forward, whoever I work with has to be a virtuoso in the same kind of mold that we were together. I mean, I
Yeah.
even thinking like Sons of Apollo, had Billy Sheehan and you had Bumblefoot, right?
Bumblefoot. Yeah, yeah,
So,
exactly.
Billy has surrounded himself in every project he's done ever since with a guy who has the capabilities of what Vi has, and they could do that kind of crazy shit together when needed. Maybe not as over the top, like you said, like that first David Lee Roth album, right? Because that, I mean, you could still listen to that today and just be blown away by it. And 100% that David Lee Roth's intent with that album and that band was that we're going to do what Van Halen does, but we're going to kick it up a notch. And
Yeah,
the secret
yeah,
weapon there is Billy Sheehan, because no
yeah.
disrespect to Michael Anthony, who is, a perfectly capable bass player, and a really great backing vocalist. He ain't doing that stuff that Billy Sheehan's doing.
Yeah,
It's like, you let Eddie
exactly.
do all the crazy stuff in that band.
Yeah.
But here you got two guys that can kind of like do this amazing artistry together. And let's face it, that album got a lot of attention.
Yeah, and the follow-up record, what's the follow-up? Just Like
Skyscraper,
Paradise is
skyscraper,
a
yeah.
skyscraper,
Yeah.
right? Where Dave just started using sequencers and the bass was
Wasn't the same. Yeah,
out,
you
and then it
tame
was
those
never the
guys
same
back a
again.
bit. Yeah,
It was didn't have that live. It did the guitar and bass dueling with each other, just go way over the top thing, just letting them be themselves. It became this sort of the box.
yeah.
They even Steve Vai's playing on Skyscraper isn't as interesting, and
No, it's
and
not.
it's
It's
really missing. It's really, really missing Billy and Steve and that sort of dynamic of the two of them cutting heads against each other. And
and that's why when that first Mr. Big album came out, and you had like right at the first track on that first Mr.
addicted
Big
to that
album,
rush, yeah.
yeah, you had um,
Paul Gilbert and Billy,
Gilbert and Billy doing that similar type thing. And I remember
yeah.
when I first got that, I was like, oh, there it is. Like
Yeah,
there it is. Billy learned from that band. It's like, well, we got to
yeah,
replicate some of that. And the good thing about Mr. Big is that they allowed for lots of musical fireworks like that, but in a very accessible
yeah,
sound. I think that's what Skyscraper was missing, is that those crazy fireworks from the Eat 'Em and Smile album didn't quite get replicated on that second album. It was a little safe, a little more poppy, right?
yeah,
And I think
radio,
that's what
yeah,
people really miss, because that album didn't do nearly as well as the first album. And I think that's what was so great about Mr. Big, is that they could do the poppy stuff, but we're going to give you all that crazy shit as well, because we know if you're fan, I mean, they have to know, right? Well, people are going to come to this band because they love Sheehan, they love
yeah,
Gilbert, right? And then everybody else. So it's like you have to have those musical fireworks. Because Paul Gilbert's another guy who came from, Racer X, and
yeah,
people
yeah.
were totally amazed by that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, there you go. There's our picks for our three favorite guitar and bass duos. Let us know what you think of our picks down in the comments down below, and let us know what your picks would be for your favorite guitar and bass duos. I'd like to thank Pete for joining me here at the Lair.
Yeah.
This was a lot of fun. Uh, Keep an eye out for our Omen video that we're going to be doing, and some of the upcoming videos on Sea of Tranquility, ranking some of those obscure 80s metal bands. All right, so thanks again to Pete and to Sea of Tranquility. Everybody out there, till we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.